In this video, I'm going to describe the events of a typical menstrual cycle in a human female. I'm going to begin this discussion at day 0 of a 28-day cycle. Now keep in mind that not all women have a 28-day cycle. In fact, that is pretty rare. But for this example, a 28-day cycle is what we're using. And at day 14, this dotted line here represents ovulation. Day 0, or the beginning of the cycle, is actually the end of the last cycle. So here we can see menses, or menstruation, is at day 0, the beginning of this particular cycle. In this part of the graph, we see the changes in the endometrium, or the lining of the uterus. What's happening here in the first couple days of the cycle, of the menstrual cycle, is that these spiral arteries that are embedded within the endometrial lining of the uterus are going to kink and they're going to spasm, and essentially they are going to allow blood to flow out of them, dislodging the tissue of the endometrium that is actively degrading. So this is the destruction of the functional zone of the endometrium, that is, a menstrual period. Immediately after a menstrual period is complete, begins the proliferative phase. Okay, so here we can see that the endometrium is getting thicker and thicker and thicker again. Here is ovulation. Right, so this is when it is possible to fertilize an egg. Okay, and the endometrium continues to grow for the second 14 days of the cycle. Now keep in mind, the second part of the cycle is always 14 days. Okay, so from day 14 to day 28, this part is a consistent 14-day length, regardless of the woman and the month. Okay, so in this second 14-day span, what's happening here is that these endometrial glands are filtering contents from the blood, and they are secreting these substances out into the lumen of the uterus, to ultimately sustain a developing embryo if one is present. And this endometrium is maintained by some other hormones that we're about to talk about. Okay, so again, this is what's happening to the lining of the uterus during a typical menstrual cycle of a human female. Now, in order to sustain this endometrium, as well as cycle through, so develop it and then shed it the next month, we need gonadotropic hormones, or gonadotropins. There are two hormones that are important to this process, FH and LSH, or FH and LH, luteinizing hormone and follicle stimulating hormone. In a previous video, I discussed this diagram here, in which I mentioned that the hypothalamus releases GnRH into the hypophyseal portal system. GnRH is going to trigger the gonadotrope cells to release mostly LH, but also FSH, depending on when and what the stimuli are. In response to LH and FSH, the follicle cells within the ovary are going to together be able to synthesize and secrete into the blood estrogen, E2 estradiol, which usually has a negative feedback farther upstream on the hypothalamus and anterior pituitary gland. Okay. However, at the middle of the cycle, there is a brief positive feedback of this estradiol, which is going to lead to a surge in LH and FSH. And after this time, we'll see an increase in progesterone, here P, and estrogen being secreted into the blood. Okay, so let's take a look at this relative to all of the other events. Okay. In the first half of the cycle, follicle stimulating hormone is triggered to be released by gonadotropin releasing hormone, GnRH, from the hypothalamus. FSH binds to cells on follicles, which are present within the ovary. In another video, I talk about how primordial follicles exist in a woman's ovary from the time she is in utero herself. Okay? Every month, some of these primordial follicles are selected to develop into primary follicles, secondary follicles, tertiary, and finally into Graafian or antral follicles. Now, during this development, FSH is stimulating more and more follicular cells to develop, And so as this gets bigger, you're getting more and more follicular cells. Ultimately, these follicular cells are going to differentiate into granulosa cells as well as theca cells. Again, together, theca cells and granulosa cells synthesize estradiol and dump it into the blood. Okay. So once again, the follicles are developing over the first half of the cycle, okay, and they are secreting estrogen. More and more granulosa cells secrete more and more estrogen. And so the overall levels of estrogen in the blood in the first half of the cycle are increasing. Okay? Because of this pronounced effect of the follicle on the levels of steroids in the blood in the first half of the cycle, this first half is called the follicular phase of the ovarian cycle. Again, the follicle is controlling the steroid levels by secreting lots of estrogen. Okay? Now, as estrogen levels get higher and higher, they will reach some threshold value that stimulates what's called the surge center. And once again, going back over here to the hypothalamus, okay, here are the GnRH neurons that are ultimately going to trigger this entire system. Usually they are inhibited by high estrogen. However, at the middle of the cycle, estrogen is going to trigger the surge center, which ultimately leads to a lot more GnRH being put into the hypophyseal blood, which leads to a surge in particularly LH, but to a lesser extent FSH as well. And so, if we look at this graph here, right before the dotted line of ovulation, LH in particular is going to drastically increase. What this is going to do is it's going to trigger the follicle to rupture, ejecting or ovulating the secondary oocyte, which this time is arrested in metaphase 2, and the corona radiata. So this is going to go off towards the uterine or fallopian tubes and maybe be exposed to sperm, possibly becoming fertilized. Okay. These cells, which were the follicle, remain behind within the ovary. Their job is not done yet. In fact, this structure is going to continue to grow and develop. It's going to change in particular ways that lead us to call it something different. After ovulation, the follicle transforms into what's called the corpus luteum. It is the corpus luteum that continues to drive the hormone profile within the blood for the second half of the cycle. In fact, the consistent 14-day half of the cycle. Because the corpus luteum is in charge, we call it the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle. So the corpus luteum is in the ovary. Okay. Once again, in a previous video, I talked about how this follicle will ultimately transform into the corpus luteum. Now, more and more cells are going to be generated, so large luteal cells, which were the granulosa cells, the small luteal cells, which were the theca cells, as well as a lot more vasculature. With this additional blood flow, as well as the change in form of the follicle, now called the corpus luteum, now more progesterone is able to be synthesized and released into the blood. Okay, there's still going to be estrogen, but now much more progesterone is able to be released. So when we go back here, we can see that the corpus luteum is secreting progesterone more and more and more until it even surpasses the level of estrogen within the blood. And so the first half of the cycle is dominated by estrogen. The second half of the cycle is dominated by progesterone. And this is important because progesterone is a pro-gestation or pro-baby hormone. And so after ovulation, the woman is fertile for a brief time. Okay, so sperm can fertilize egg, and if that is the case, ultimately the embryo can implant within the uterine lining or the endometrium. And so it's really important to maintain this endometrium to be nice and thick, to be nice and cushy, secrete all of these substances to sustain the developing embryo before the end of this 14 days. Okay, so progesterone must be very high in order to maintain the endometrium. Okay. Note up here that the gonadotropins return back to their original levels, right? So in fact, a little bit lower than the levels in the first half of the cycle, because the negative feedback has resumed after ovulation is complete. Okay. As time progresses towards the end of this cycle, the egg, right, the secondary oocyte, if it has been fertilized, once again, can implant within the uterine lining, the endometrium. If that is the case, the chorion, or what will become the chorion of this developing offspring, is going to release something called HCG, human chorionic gonadotropin. Okay. If the corpus luteum detects human chorionic gonadotropin, it is going to maintain the endometrium, because the corpus luteum is going to continue living, okay, continue secreting progesterone, which maintains the endometrial lining. Now, if there is no fertilization, so no embryo implants within the endometrium, without HCG, the corpus luteum is going to start to degrade into something called the corpus albicans, or this kind of white body, white scar in the ovary. As these cells die off, they secrete less and less progesterone, less and less estrogen, and ultimately, a threshold level of progesterone is surpassed, right, or progesterone drops beneath it, and that is going to trigger the degradation of the endometrium as opposed to the maintenance of the endometrium. Okay. Once again, this is the typical events of a menstrual cycle in a human female. The first half of the cycle is controlled by the follicle. Follicle growth is driven by FSH. As the follicle gets bigger, it secretes more and more estrogen. Around the middle of the cycle, estrogen surpasses some threshold, which is going to trigger the surge center in the hypothalamus to essentially reverse the feedback from negative feedback to positive feedback, leading to this surge in LH in particular, but also FSH. LH is going to trigger the follicle to rupture, releasing the secondary oocyte and corona radiata for potential fertilization, and the remaining follicular cells are going to develop into the corpus luteum. The corpus luteum continues to secrete estrogen, although at this point, the negative feedback has been reversed, or it has been returned, and so estrogen drops for a little while before the corpus luteum gets large enough to start increasing the levels of this hormone once again. So estrogen is pretty important in the second half of the cycle, but progesterone is even more important. The corpus luteum alone is going to secrete progesterone in quite a high abundance in the second half of this cycle, right? During the secretory phase of the uterine cycle, which is also called the luteal phase of the ovarian cycle because of the action of the corpus luteum. Progesterone is important because progesterone sustains the endometrial lining. If there is no fertilized egg by about day 10 over here, there will be no HCG, therefore no stimulus to maintain the corpus luteum, and so the corpus luteum degrades. It's going to die, and as it dies, it's going to secrete less and less progesterone. Without progesterone, there is no progesterone to bind to receptors on the endometrium, therefore nothing to trigger the endometrium to be maintained. And so by day 14 after ovulation, always day 14, the endometrium is going to start to degrade. Spiral arteries kink and spasm, glands start to recede, and the blood flow from these arteries is going to slough off tissue that is degrading in the absence of progesterone. I hope this helps. Make sure you check out the previous videos to kind of put all of the pieces together. Thanks for watching.